Close your eyes and imagine a flame that must never go out. A flickering pulse of light that served as the spiritual equivalent of national Wi-Fi for an entire empire. In ancient Rome, if this fire flickered into darkness, the consequences were treated with the same gravity as detonating a nuke in the middle of the Senate floor. A woman was led to a quiet field, handed a single loaf of bread, a flickering oil lamp, and a pitch of water, then buried alive in a stone room. Tonight we aren't looking at Rome's marble triumphs, but at the chilling theatrical punishments that turned justice into a silent, subterranean nightmare. While the empire gave us roads and legal codes, it also birthed penalties so bizarre they sound like fever dreams, from being sewn into a leather sack with a wandering serpent to the slow, golden glow of a tunic made of flammable pitch. But you are safe here. You are separated from that ancient world by 2,000 years of falling dust and the quiet, heavy passage of time. As the hum of your room settles, let the weight of the present vanish. We are journeying back to a city where the law was written in shadow, and where silence was often the final sentence. Take a deep breath and let the cool air settle in your lungs. Tonight, the heavy stone of the Colosseum is not a place of noise, but a relic of a time when the Roman mind worked in ways we can barely comprehend. We are not here for the politics of the Senate or the clatter of chariot wheels. Instead, we are easing into the strange, unsettling corners of history to explore a world where justice was a public performance. A dark, atmospheric display of power designed to haunt the memories of everyone who watched. Though the shadows grow longer, settle deeply into your pillows. If these journeys into the past help you find the rest you seek, feel free to join our community of night travelers by subscribing, but only if this space feels like home to you. It is always a comfort to know who is listening in the stillness. Tell me, where are you tuning in from? And what time does the moon find you tonight? The lights now dim the lights completely. If you have a fan, let its soft mechanical hum become the background to our journey, masking the sounds of the modern world outside. Let's move together into the long cooling shadows of the Roman sun. In the Roman view of the universe, certain crimes were seen as more than just breaking a law. They were viewed as a direct threat to the very fabric of existence. They believed the safety of the entire empire rested on a delicate balance with the gods. When that balance was tipped, the response was a masterpiece of poetic terror. The Romans were masters of the legal loophole. They found ways to execute the unexecutable without technically spilling a drop of blood, all to avoid a divine tantrum from the gods they so feared. It was a world where HR policies were written in stone and fueled by a very specific kind of fear. A fear that your job could quite literally lead to you sleeping underground permanently. As your thoughts begin to slow and the edges of the room soften, we prepare to meet our first subject. They were women handpicked before puberty served the goddess Vesta, keeper of the eternal flame. They lived in the heart of the city, yet they existed in a state of constant, quiet tension, carrying the spiritual weight of a civilization on their shoulders. Becoming a Vestal was a massive honor. You received front row seats at the games, traveled in fancy carriages, and held the power to pardon a prisoner with a single word. But all that prestige came with one little catch, a vow of chastity that lasted for 30 years. To break this vow wasn't just a scandal. It was an act of treason against the gods themselves. We start with the story of this sacred fire and the devastating price of a single flickering flame. We are drifting now toward the temple of Vesta, where the high price of virginity was paid in a way that remains one of history's most lingering. Ghostly whispers. Imagine the silence of the field, the weight of the earth, and the finality of a stone seal. As we ease into the details, remember that your boss today might be difficult. But at least they aren't threatening to bury you in a hole with some stale bread and a dusty oil lamp. In Rome, the law didn't just punish. It made a statement that echoed through the centuries. Let the ancient world rise around you as we explore the fate of the Vestals, the women who lived between the warmth of the flame and the coldness of the earth. In the quiet, flickering heart of ancient Rome, there existed a group of women who held the spiritual weight of an entire empire on their shoulders, the Vestal Virgins. They were the keepers of the eternal flame, a sacred fire that represented the life force of Rome itself. In many ways, these women were the spiritual equivalent of a national heartbeat. If their service faltered, if the fire dimmed, the Romans believed the sun itself might not rise with the same strength. Handpicked before they even reached puberty, they were chosen to serve the goddess Vesta, the guardian of the hearth and the home. Their primary duty was simple yet monumental. Keep that sacred fire burning, and perhaps even more importantly, stay away from the touch of men for a period of 30 years. For 3 long decades, the Vestal lived a life of immense prestige and luxury that few others could imagine. They were granted front-row seats at the great games, traveled through the crowded, dusty Roman streets in fancy, gilded carriages, and even possessed the unique legal power to pardon a condemned prisoner with a single word. But all this power, all of this honor, came with a catch that whispered in the back of their minds every night. In the eyes of the Roman state, breaking a vow of chastity was not just a personal scandal or a moral failing. It was treated like detonating a nuke in the middle of a Senate floor. If a Vestal was caught fooling around, the punishment was a descent into a literal subterranean nightmare. The Romans faced a strange theological dilemma when it came to punishing a wayward Vestal. Because they were sacred to the goddess, the Romans believed that one could not spill a Vestal's blood without deeply offending the gods and bringing a divine tantrum down upon the city. To navigate this, they discovered a terrifyingly clever loophole. Instead of a traditional execution by the sword, the Vestal was buried alive. Not metaphorically cancelled, and not simply sent away in disgrace, but straight up entombed underground while her heart was still beating. The process was handled with a cold clinical precision that was uniquely Roman. They would dig a small pit, a stone chamber deep beneath the earth, and lower the woman into the cooling soil, to technically avoid the charge of murder by starvation. They would provide her with a flickering oil lamp, a little bit of bread, and a small pitcher of water. It was a gesture of hydration and sustenance that served only to prolong the inevitable. Once she was inside, the entrance was sealed tight. No blood was spilled, no mess was made, and the divine laws were technically satisfied. Imagine for a moment the silence of that chamber, the smell of the damp earth, the tiny dancing flame of the oil lamp. The men involved in these scandals did not share this elaborate fate. They were usually whipped to death in a public square. For the Vestal, however, there was only the stillness. One famous instance involved a Vestal named Cornelia during the reign of Emperor Domitian. As she was being led to her sentence, she reportedly shouted a bold defense, questioning if the Caesar truly thought she had been unfaithful when no mortal man had ever touched her. Her defiance, however, changed nothing. She was still sent to sleep permanently beneath the Roman soil. But as you settle deeper into your own bed tonight, let the weight of that ancient silence remind you of the profound peace of your own surroundings. Unlike the poor girl lying in the dark, thinking about her life choices while Rome moved on without her, you are enveloped in a cocoon of absolute safety. There is no flickering lamp for you to monitor. There is no sacred fire you must guard through the night. There is certainly no threat of a stone seal being placed over your head. The air you breathe is free, cool, and effortless. The darkness around you is not a cave. It is a comfort, a soft velvet blanket that invites you to let go. If you ever feel overwhelmed by the demands of your modern life, or the pressures of a job that feels too heavy to carry, just remember that at least your boss isn't threatening to bury you in a hole with some stale bread and a dusty oil lamp. Rome was a place where HR policies were written in stone and fear. It was a civilization that valued order above all else, and the Vestals were the silent sentinels of that order, existing at the fragile boundary between the warmth of the flame and the coldness of the earth. Listen to the rhythm of your own breathing. It is steady. It is calm. You are here in the present, where the only thing required of you is to rest. The stories of the past are merely echoes now, drifting further and further away into the mist. The Vestal's silence is a story told to the stars, a reminder of a world that has long since crumbled into dust. But while the Vestals faced a lonely, silent end to their perceived betrayals, Rome reserved an even more bizarre and chaotic ritual for those who committed the ultimate family taboo. As we leave the silent tomb of the Vestal behind, we move toward a punishment that sounds less like a legal sentence and more like a fever dream involving a leather sack and a group of very unusual roommates. We transition now from the stillness of the underground to the frantic poetic justice of the penalty of the sack. We are moving toward the river now, where the animals await you. As the heavy, silent dust of the Vestal's tomb fades into the distant, flickering mist of history, we find ourselves moving away from the dry earth toward the rhythmic, flowing sounds of the river Tiber. The air here is cooling, damp with the scent of reeds, river mud, and ancient running water. But even here in the natural beauty of the riverside, the atmosphere remains thick with a very specific kind of Roman tint. We are entering the dark, surreal realm of primal, a term that translates simply to the penalty of the sack. While it may sound like a quirky name for a forgotten game, for the citizens of Rome, it represented the ultimate response to the ultimate taboo, parricide, the act of killing one's own father. In a society built entirely on the sacred foundation of the family unit, to strike down the patriarch was not just a crime, it was an attempt to dismantle the universe itself. The Romans did not simply slap such a criminal with a fine or toss them into a standard stones. No, for a crime that defied the natural order, they devised a punishment that felt like a waking fever dream, a masterpiece of symbolic horror. If you were found guilty of this profound betrayal, the state would prepare a deluxe punishment pack, starring you in 4 very unfortunate, very confused animal roommates. Imagine the scene at the water's edge. First, the authorities would tie your hands, perhaps giving you one final, quiet moment to reflect on the bad decisions and the internal darkness that led you to this riverbank. You were then forced into a large, heavy sack made of raw leather. It is dark, cramped, and smells of salt and cured hide. But you are not alone in the shadows. One by one, your companions are introduced into the sack with you. A dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. Close your eyes and try to visualize the sheer, chaotic geography of that leather bag. It is a blender of panic and poetic justice. You might feel the frantic headbutt of a panicked monkey, while the dry scales of a snake coil rhythmically around your leg. The dog is losing its mind in the absolute darkness, and the rooster, confused by the sudden confinement and the scent of the river, thinks it is sunrise and begins to announce your doom with a piercing cry. It is a hissing, yelping, screeching symphony of animal rage, the worst escape room ever devised, from which there is no exit. While this sounds like pure theater, the Romans chose these specific animals for reasons that were deeply buried in their philosophy. The dog was included to represent the loyalty and protection you failed to show your own kin. The monkey was a symbol of the chaotic, subhuman nature of your act. The snake represented the deceit and venom of the betrayal. And the rooster was there for vigilance, a constant, piercing reminder that the light of justice would always find you, even in the dark. In the Roman mind, your sins were being made into flesh and feathers, trapped in the dark with you as you prepared for the final descent. Once the sack was sewn shut, bursting with bad decisions and animal panic, it was hauled to the edge of the deep water and hurled into the current. There is a sudden heavy splash, followed by the muffled bubbling sounds of the struggle beneath the surface. The leather grows cold as the river Tiber embraces it, pulling the chaotic bundle down into the silt, the reeds, and the ultimate silence of the water. But as you lie in your own space now, listen to the imagined sound of that water. It is not a place of struggle for you, for you. The river is a slow, steady pulse, a liquid weight that washes away the frantic energy of the day. You are not in the sack. You are safe, dry, and perfectly still in your bed. The chaos of the Puinacale is nothing more than a story from a world that valued symbolic justice above all else, a world that believed the punishment must mirror the soul of the crime. You can let go of the tension in your jaw and your shoulder. The monkey, the snake, and the rooster are nothing more than fading ink on an ancient, dusty scroll. The river is quiet now. The sack has long since settled into the history of the mud, and the ripples on the surface of the Tiber have smoothed out into a perfect glassy reflection of the moon and the stars. In our modern world, we deal with family jokes or forgotten birthdays with a sigh, but in Rome, the bonds of blood were reinforced with the circus of the serpent. The Romans loved the theatrical, and they loved making a point that would linger in the minds of the spectators long after the market day was over. They believed that to truly cleanse the city, the criminal had to be removed from the sight of the sun and the touch of the earth. But as we drift away from the damp riverbank, we realize that Rome's creative flair for suffering did not stop with leather bags and animals. Sometimes they took the most standard, most recognizable form of execution and flipped it entirely on its head, literally. We move now from the splashing of the river to the agonizing, rhythmic strain of the wooden cross. But this is not the crucifixion you think you know. We are transitioning into a world where dying upright wasn't quite humiliating enough, and where even a sentence of death could be turned into a strange, final act of humility. We move now to the inverted cross, where the script of suffering was flipped, and the blood rushed to the head in a different kind of silence. Let the sound of the river fade as we approach the wooden beams of the Appian Way. The world is turning upside down, but you remain perfectly grounded, perfectly still, and perfectly safe. As the rhythmic splashing of the river Tiber fades into a distant watery memory, we leave the chaotic circus of the serpent behind and find ourselves standing on a dusty road just outside the high stone city wall. The air here is dry still and carries the faint, warm scent of cedar wood and sun-baked earth. We are approaching a sight that was all too common in the Roman landscape, the wooden cross. It was Rome's signature punishment, brutal, public, and designed to humble anyone who dared to challenge the absolute power of the state. Most of us, when we hear the word crucifixion, think of a single, iconic image. A slow, agonizing death meant to serve as a stark warning to the masses. It was a cold efficiency machine of suffering, combining physical exhaustion with a total, crushing public humiliation. But the Romans, ever the fans of creative flair and dramatic direction, did not always stick to the standard, upright script. Sometimes they threw in a theatrical twist that changed the very meaning and gravity of the act. This was the inverted crucifixion, a method where the victim was nailed to the cross upside down, because, apparently, dying upright was not quite humiliating enough for the imperial authorities. This method was reserved for special cases, for the rebels and the traitors whom the state wanted to make a truly unforgettable example of. However, perhaps the most famous upside-down crucifixion in all of human history was not born of imperial spite, but of a strange, final request. According to long-standing tradition, when St. Peter, one of the 12 apostles, was sentenced to die under the heavy reign of Emperor Nero, he faced the wooden beams with a surprising lack of resistance, but he had one quiet, unwavering condition. He reportedly looked at his executioners and said, "Crucify me upside down, for I am not worthy to die like my Lord." And Rome, being an efficiency machine, had rarely turned down an opportunity for a more intense, memorable spectacle, simply agreed. Imagine, if you will, a slow shift in perspective as the world begins to flip. In a standard crucifixion, the struggle is with the lungs and the heavy weight of the body pulling downward. But when the cross is inverted, the entire dynamic of the body changes. Blood rushes slowly to the head, muscles strain in unnatural, agonizing ways, and the very act of breathing becomes an uphill battle. It was a total inversion of the senses, a world turned on its head. Yet, as you lie here in the perfect, unshakable safety of your own bed, feel the rounding weight of your mattress beneath. You are not suspended in the air. You are deeply supported by the earth. You are not straining against gravity. You are releasing into it. The blood in your veins is flowing at a gentle, rhythmic, resting pace, and your breath is as easy and natural as a summer breeze through a garden. The inverted cross, for all its physical intensity in the ancient world, became something ironically beautiful. In the long hands of history, it became a symbol of profound, quiet humility. Peter's choice was meant to show reverence, turning an instrument of state-sponsored terror into a final, hushed act of devotion. The image of the inverted cross has been co-opted over the centuries by horror movies and metal bands, giving it a dark, rebellious, and misunderstood spin. But for the Romans and the early followers who stood in the dust that day, it was a moment of quiet, intense reverence. The Romans themselves did not care much for the deep symbolism. For them, it was just another way to send a message that crossing the empire would result in a death as weird and memorable as possible. They turned any punishment into a piece of performance art, ensuring that even a man's final moments were directed with a cold, dramatic flair. But now, let that image of the wooden beings soften and begin to blur at the edges. The dust of the Appian Way is settling back into the ground, and the harsh, golden sun of the Roman afternoon is beginning to dip peacefully below the horizon. The wood of the cross is returning to the earth, and the stories of the apostles are becoming nothing more than whispers, carried away by the night wind. You are safe, you are at peace, the world is right side up, and you are exactly where you need to be. Not all Roman symbols were born of spiritual humility, however. Some were forged in the cold, hard, mathematical logic of the legion, where fear was the only thing keeping the lines straight and the shield locked. As we leave the quiet, heavy reverence of the inverted cross behind, we move toward a military punishment so cold and so calculated that it makes a modern boot camp look like a day of rest. We transition now from the individual sacrifice to the collective, shared trauma of the Roman legion. We are moving toward the ranks of the soldiers, where every 10th man is about to face a very different kind of team-building exercise. We are moving toward the rhythmic, terrifying shadow of decimation. Listen for the sound of the soldiers' boots. They are marching closer, but they cannot reach you in the stillness of your room. As the spiritual stillness of the inverted cross fades into the cooling background of history, we find ourselves standing on the vast, dusty edge of a Roman military plain. The air here is markedly different. It is no longer filled with the soft scent of cedar and prayer, but with the cold, metallic tang of iron, the smell of leather, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of thousands of boots hitting the earth in perfect, unshakable unison. This is the heart of the Roman legion, the most formidable and disciplined fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. But with this legendary machine of war, there existed a motivational strategy so brutal, so mathematically cold, that it makes any modern hardship look like a day of rest. We are entering the chilling world of decimation, the ultimate, terrifying form of team accountability. Imagine the scene as the harsh sun begins to set over the military encampment, casting long, jagged shadows across the rows of tents. The unit has shown cowardice in the heat of battle, or perhaps they whispered of mutiny in the dark of their quarters. In the Roman military, failure was not just a private shame. It was a collective infection that had to be purged with surgical precision. The commander would invoke the nuclear option of discipline. The entire group of soldiers men who had bled together, marched across continents together, and shared their meager rations of wine and bread would be ordered to stand in a long, silent, and suffocating line. The process was as simple as it was devastating. The soldiers would draw lots, and every 10th man would find himself standing alone, separated from his brothers in arms. But the true horror of decimation was not just the sentence of death itself, it was the method of its execution. The lucky 9 survivors were not permitted to look away while a stranger performed the deed. Instead, they were ordered to take up clubs, stones, or whatever heavy objects were nearby and beat their own comrade. The man they had protected with their very shields just the day before until he was no more. It was a survivor, Roman Legion edition, where nobody won immunity. and every survivor left with a psychological trauma that could never be unwritten. But even as you hear the heavy rhythmic echoes of this ancient discipline, feel the absolute, unmoving safety of your own surroundings. You are not standing in that dusty line. You are tucked away in the warmth and the stillness of your own room, where the only accountability you have is to your own comfort and your own deep rest. The ironclad logic of the Roman commanders cannot reach you through the veil of time. There are no lots for you to draw, and there are no heavy stones for you to carry. Your only task tonight is to let the weight of your own body sink deeper and deeper into the softness of your bed, as grounded and secure as the ancient roots of a mountain. The Romans believed that if a soldier feared his own comrades and his own commander more than the enemy's blade, he would never, ever break rank. Decimation was a psychological masterpiece of cold-blooded efficiency. It turned a unit of individual men into a single, unshakable wall of iron, held together by a shared, unspoken grief. One of the most infamous uses of this practice was by Crassus, the incredibly wealthy general who led the fight against the Spartacus slave revolt. After his troops suffered a humiliating defeat, he decimated a disgraced unit to prove that failure was a debt that would always be paid in blood. The survivors of such a ritual were not given a reprieve or a weekend of rest to mourn their fallen friend. Instead, they were subjected to a lingering, public humiliation that lasted for weeks. They were stripped of their wheat rations and given barley or grain, usually reserved for livestock, and were forced to set up their tents outside the safety and the warmth of the fortified camp wall. It was the Roman way of saying they were no longer part of the pack. A constant daily reminder that they were living on borrowed time, separated from the community they had failed to protect. Listen now to the imagined fading sound of the legion, marching away into the rising twilight. It is a steady hypnotic pulse. Thump, thump, thump. The brassy, haunting call of the corner the massive Roman war horn echoes off the distant hills, signaling the end of the day and the beginning of the watch. The soldiers move in perfect mechanical sync, a sea of red and iron, disappearing slowly into the rising night. This discipline was cold, it was calculated, and it was carved into the very bone of every man who wore the uniform. But as the sound of the boots grows fainter and fainter, and the dust of the military road settles back into the quiet, dark earth, the world becomes still once more. The iron is cooling, the shields are being laid down for the night. You can feel the last bit of tension leaving your own limbs, mirroring the absolute stillness of the abandoned plain. The Roman military was a machine of order, but even their most rigid systems eventually gave way to the silence of the night. We realize now that while decimation silenced the rebellious spirit through force and trauma, there were other quieter ways Rome ensured that certain words were never spoken again. We move now from the open, windy battlefield to the shadowed, narrow hallways of the later empire, where the law was no longer about a club or a stone, but about a sharp iron fork in a jagged, lonely cliff. We transition from the collective fear of the soldiers to the individual silence of the heretic and the traitor. We are moving toward the cold metal of the fork and the sudden, breathtaking stop of the Tarpeian rock. Silence was not just a virtue in Rome. It was a physical requirement enforced by gravity and steel. Let the drums of the legion fade into the whisper of the wind as we approach the edge of the city, as the rhythmic, distant thud of the marching legions finally fades into a dusty memory of the open plains. We leave the world of military discipline behind and enter the shadowed, narrower hallways of the later Roman Empire. The air here feels different, heavier, more confined, and filled with a quiet, lingering tension. Rome had become increasingly obsessed with the whispers in the dark, with the thoughts and the words of its citizens. In these twilight centuries, the law was no longer just about maintaining the order of the ranks. It was about the absolute control of the human mind and the restless spirit. If you spoke out against the sacred beliefs of the state or challenged the shifting tides of the church, Rome did not just scold you, it gifted you an accessory you would never forget. This was the Fork of Heretics, a starter pack for sinners designed to enforce a silence that was as much a physical requirement as it was a spiritual one. Imagine a metal rod, cold and unforgiving, with two sharp prongs at each end. One end was placed firmly under your chin, while the other was jammed right into your upper chest, creating a miniature trident that sandwiched your neck. It was an accessory of absolute stillness. Once this device was strapped on, the simple human act of moving your head became a dangerous and painful gamble. If you tried to look down, you were stabbed by the iron. If you began to nod off from sheer exhaustion, you were stabbed. Even a whispered thought to the person standing next to you resulted in the sharp, cold poke of your own iron collar. It did not always draw blood at first. That was the subtle psychological genius of the fork. It was meant to exhaust you mentally, physically, and spiritually until your will simply dissolved. You would be left standing, sometimes for days on end, straining every small muscle in your neck and your shoulders just to avoid the iron prongs. It was a game of don't move, or the prize was simply not impaling your own throat. To make the punishment even more theatrical, these forks sometimes featured Latin inscriptions engraved into the metal. Phrases like "I renounce my sin," or "I am guilty," ensuring that as you struggled to stay still, you were literally being pressed by your own confession. It was a quiet, internal panic, a course in agony that required no public execution, only your own mounting fatigue and the weight of the iron. But as you listen to the story of the fork, feel the effortless, cooling freedom of your own body. Your neck is completely relaxed, supported by the soft, welcoming weight of your pillow. There is no iron pressing against your skin, and no requirement for you to remain still for even a second. You are free to shift, to turn, and to let your head sink deeper and deeper into the comfort of your bed. The air around your throat is cool, unrestricted, and easy to breathe, a stark and beautiful contrast to the rigid, forced silence of the late Roman heretic. You are safe in the present moment, where silence is a choice you make for your own peace, not a sentence enforced by a rusty prong. While the fork managed the internal, private silence of the city, Rome had an older, more primal way of dealing with those who betrayed the state. This was the Tarpeian Rock, the city's original and most final way of unfriending a citizen. Located on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, just a short stroll from the busy, sun-drenched Roman Forum, this jagged 80-foot drop was where the Republic took out the trash by launching traitors straight into the void. It was not just a scenic viewpoint, it was a final theatrical exit from Roman society, a way to be erased from the city's heart. The rock earned its name from Tarpeia, a Roman girl who, according to the old legends, betrayed the city to enemy invaders in exchange for what she thought would be golden bracelets. The invaders, however, were literal thinkers. They crushed her with their heavy shields instead, and tossed her broken body from the cliff. From that moment on, the Tarpeian Rock became the state's favorite tool for dealing with corrupt officials, false witnesses, and anyone who made the empire decide they were no longer worthy of being called Rome. There was no slow execution here, no complicated machine, just a short flight and a sudden, silent stop. The condemned were often stripped of their dignity, paraded through the crowded streets, and marched to the very edge where gravity handled the sentence. To be thrown from the rock was the ultimate cancel culture of the ancient world. You were not just dying, you were being physically and spiritually removed from the city, tossed away like refuse into the jagged, lonely hills below. Interestingly, the rock sat just a stone's throw from the temple of Jupiter. This meant that a traitor's final moments often included a front-row view of heaven before the ground rose up to meet them. But as the echo of those falling names fades into the jagged, ancient landscape of the past, let the profound stillness of your own room return to the center of your mind. You are grounded, you are secure. The only thing falling is the weight of your eyelids, which grow heavier and more peaceful with every passing second. The Tarpeian Rock is nothing more than a silent cliff in a distant, dusty land, and the heretic's fork has long since rusted into the earth. Rome was a civilization that turned even the simplest laws of physics into a message of absolute power, using gravity and steel to ensure that its citizens remain still and silent. As we leave the lonely heights of the Capitoline Hill and the quiet, internal suffering of the heretics behind, we realize that for some, a fall or a fort was not enough of the spectacle. For the most defiant of enemies, for the most public of crimes, Rome demanded something more than a quiet cliff. They demanded theater. They demanded the roar of a crowd. We move now from the quiet individual isolation of the cliffside to the sun-drenched, chaotic roar of the arena. We are moving toward the Colosseum, where 50,000 fans are waiting for the main event, where death is no longer a private affair, but a grand performance of blood, beast, and bone. We are moving toward the lions. Listen for the sound of the crowd. It is far away, a low hum that cannot touch the peace of your room. The quiet, lonely heights of the Capitoline Hill and the cold, internal suffering of the heretics now begin to fade into a warm golden haze of a late Roman afternoon. We are moving away from the isolated silence of the cliffside and toward the sun-drenched, chaotic roar of the city's very heart. The air here is markedly different. It is thick with the scent of hot stone, trampled sand, and the faint copper tang of anticipation. We are approaching the Colosseum, a massive monument of stone, sweat, and 0 roaring fans. For the Romans, this was more than a stadium. It was their version of a grand public theater, a place where the entire city gathered to witness the ultimate display of imperial power. But today's main event is not a simple gladiatorial bout. It is damnatio ad bestias, or as we might understand it, the condemnation to the beast. This punishment was Rome's primary method for dealing with those they deemed the most public of enemies, the hardened criminals, the traitors, and most tragically, those who refused to bow to the imperial guard. But for the Roman mind, a simple, private execution was a wasted opportunity. They believed in theater and the power of the grand, public performance, and they transformed the final moments of a life into a high-stakes morality play. The condemned were not merely tossed into the arena sand. They were often dressed up in elaborate, beautifully crafted costumes to reenact the very myths the crowd had grown up hearing since childhood. Visualize the surreal, terrifying grandeur of the arena floor as the cages are winched open. One unlucky soul might find himself dressed as Orpheus, standing in the center of the sand with a lyre in his hand, supposed to charm the world, only to be mauled by a lion with solo. Another might be strapped to a prop rock to play the role of Prometheus, while hungry birds were encouraged to peck at him in an accurate, gruesome reenactment of the ancient legend. It was entertainment, justice, and religious propaganda all rolled into one fur-covered disaster. There was no chance for defense, and no hope for a trial. This was a death sentence wrapped in a thunderous, terrifying round of applause. If the lions were sleeping, or the leopards hesitant under the bright sun, the Romans had tricks to ensure the show continued, using hot irons or days of starvation to provoke the animals into a frantic frenzy. It was a world where you could end up as lion lunch for something as simple as a theft or a misplaced political joke. Yet as you hear the faint, imagined echoes of that roaring crowd, feel the absolute cooling stillness of your own room. You are not on the sun-baked sand of the arena. You are safe in the soft velvet sanctuary of your own bed, where the only audience is the quiet night and the only performance required of you is the gentle, effortless act of falling asleep. The Romans used these beastly spectacles as a calculated warning. Step out of line, and this theatrical gore could be yours. It was a rule maintained by fear and felines. But as the sun begins to set over the massive stone arches of the Colosseum, the roar of the 50,000 starts to soften, turning into a low, distant hum that fades into the rising evening mist. The sand is being swept. The heavy iron cages are being locked, and the grand theater of blood is finally closing its doors for the night. The violence of the arena is nothing more than a story from a distant, crumbled past, a flickering image that cannot cross the threshold of your feet. You can let every bit of tension drain from your limbs, mirroring the absolute quiet that now settles over the empty, cooling stone tiers of the stadium. The lions are asleep, and the myths have returned to the dry pages of history. For most in the arena, it was a loud and public end, but the spectacle is over now, leaving only the moonlight on the stone. But as we leave the fading, ghostly echoes of the arena behind, we realize that not everyone in Rome is destined for the spectacle of the Senate. For some, especially those who walk the higher marble halls of power, there is a different path, a quieter, more private, and supposedly more honorable exit from the world. We transition now from the roaring, public chaos of the lions to the hushed, still rooms of the Roman elite. We are moving toward a final monologue, a warm, tranquil bath, and a choice that allowed a man to write his own ending in the flickering candlelight. We are moving toward the quiet, heavy dignity of forced suicide. Listen to the stillness. It is deep and welcoming as the golden sun finally dips below the distant Roman horizon, and the ghostly fading echoes of the arena's roar vanish into the rising evening mist. We move away from the public sound and into the hushed marble hallways of the Roman elite. The air here is markedly different. It is still, cooling, and perfumed with the faint, sweet scent of expensive oils, and the heavy and invisible weight of centuries of political secret. In ancient Rome, receiving a death sentence did not always mean being dragged to a jagged, lonely cliff or being tossed to the hunger of the lions in a crowded stadium. Sometimes, if you were fortunate, or rather if you were highly connected to the upper echelons of imperial society, you were granted a very special, very private kind of punishment. Forced suicide? It may sound contradictory to our modern ears to be forced into an act of self-termination, but in the Roman mind, it was viewed as a rare mercy, a final way to depart from the world with a semblance of control and dignity. Imagine for a moment that you are a powerful senator or a wealthy noble, someone who spends your long days debating the fate of distant provinces in the high, echoing halls of power. Perhaps you managed to offend the pride of the emperor, or maybe you were caught in the tangled, invisible web of a failed political coup. Instead of a sudden, public arrest in the crowded street, you would receive a quiet, private visit at your villa. A messenger would arrive at your door, bearing a polite, handwritten scroll from the emperor himself. The message was simple and chillingly direct. You have dishonored the state. Please take the honorable route out. The translation of those words was absolute. End your own life by the time the sun sets, or the state will do it for you in a way that is far more brutal, far more public, and far less beautiful. There was a pragmatic, almost generous side to this dark and silent request. If you complied and took your own life in the privacy of your home, you were not just saving yourself from the terrifying, screaming theater of the arena. You were protecting your entire legacy and the future of your bloodline. By choosing the honorable route, your family would be allowed to keep your vast property, your lands, and your ancestral wealth, and your name might even remain unblemished in the official records of the city. It was the Roman version of the final severance package, signed in blood instead of paperwork. It allowed a man to remain the master of his own house until his very last breath, transforming a cold execution into a final, deliberate, and deeply personal choice. As you lie in the profound stillness of your own room, now feel the deep, grounding peace of having no such heavy choices to make. Your legacy is safe, your home is secure, and the only scroll you need to attend to tonight is the gentle, effortless closing of your own eyes. There is no messenger waiting at your door, and no sunset deadline looming over your head. You are enveloped in a warm cocoon of absolute privacy and calm, where the only thing required of you is to let go of the day's lingering worries and sink deeper and deeper into the welcoming softness of your pillow. The most famous example of this noble and quiet exit was the great philosopher Seneca the Younger. Accused of participating in a conspiracy against the erratic and dangerous Emperor Nero, Seneca was told that he must end his own life. He did so with the poise and the unwavering calm of a true Stoic, even as the world around him began to crumble. He stepped into a warm, tranquil bath, a steaming environment that mirrored the comfort you feel right now, and opened his veins, using his final precious moments to deliver a calm monologue to his closest friends and students. It was a scene of calculated philosophical control, a beautiful and slow-motion departure from a world that had become too chaotic and too loud for a man of peace to inhabit. He controlled the timing, the setting, and the very words that would define his end. But even as we respect the quiet, marble dignity of the bath and the blade, we realize that for many others in the Roman world, the act of sitting or standing was not a choice of comfort, but a cruel tool of agony. Rome was a civilization of profound extreme, where the warm, steaming bath for a senator lived alongside a cold, sharp, and razor-thin beam for a common thief or a rebellious slave. As we leave the hushed, perfumed rooms of the elite and the cooling steam of Seneca's final bath, we move toward a device that turned the simple human act of sitting into a crime against the body. We transition now from the noble's final monologue to the frantic, distant wailing of the public marketplace. We are moving toward a wooden structure that offered no dignity, no legacy, and no peace. We are moving toward the sharp, narrow peak of the wooden dome. There is no warm water here, only the cold, unyielding weight of the earth and the heavy iron weights tied to the ankles, pulling you down against the sharp edge of the beam. Listen to the silence of the bathhouse as it fades, replaced by the distant, rhythmic creak of unyielding wood. We are moving closer to the pain pony of doom, where posture was the only thing that mattered. The marble floor turns to dirt, the monologue turns to a silent struggle, as the distant rhythmic creak of the wooden donkey and the sharp, busy cries of the marketplace finally fade into a quiet gray mist. We leave the physical world of bone and blood behind. We are moving away from the tangible reality of Rome's iron grip, entering a realm that reaches much further than any arena or any lonely cliffside into the very heart of human memory. Legacy and absolute, total obliteration. This is Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory, perhaps the most haunting and chillingly beautiful punishment that ancient Rome ever devised. Most Roman punishments ended with the final destruction of the body, but this reached out across time to grasp the very soul of a person's existence. It is a punishment that asks a terrifying, lingering question: what is worse than death? And the Roman answer was simple, cold, and absolute: being forgotten on purpose. If you were a powerful emperor who had embarrassed the high state, a general who had led a failed and broken rebellion, or a high-ranking senator who fell too far from the shifting graces of the powerful, Rome might not just take your life. They would embark on a systematic, state-funded campaign to delete you from the very fabric of time itself. Imagine the great city coming alive in the early morning, with the sound of thousands of small, rhythmic hammer strikes echoing off the marble. These were not the hopeful sounds of building a new future, but the steady sounds of unmaking a path. Statues of the condemned were smashed to heavy pieces or pulled down and defaced in the market. Inscriptions on grand marble monuments were meticulously chiseled out, leaving only raw, jagged, and empty gaps where a name once stood in proud gold. Portraits were painted over, their features replaced by the faces of those who came after, effectively erasing a human life from the record of the eye. Your name would be struck from every official document, every shining coin, and every public record of the city. If you had achieved great things for the empire, if you had won battles or built roads, those victories were reassigned to someone else. And if you had supporters, they were silenced or forced to participate in the slow, mechanical erasing of your name. And the most devastating part of this historical vaporization is that it worked. Many of the people subjected to Damnatio Memoriae were once the most powerful and feared individuals in the entire world. Yet today we do not even remember their names because Rome was that effective and that thorough in their deletion. Entire reigns, years of complex history, and countless personal stories vanished into an artificial, state-mandated silence. But as you listen to the story of this erasure, feel the unshakable, grounding permanence of your own presence in this moment. You are here, you are known, you are safe and secure in the profound stillness of your own room. Unlike the flickering ghosts of ancient Rome, your memory is not being chiseled away by the hands of men. You are surrounded by the things that define your comfort, the soft, familiar weight of your blankets, the cool scent of the evening air, and the steady, quiet rhythm of your own heart. There is no chisel at your name, and no hand painting over your personal history. You are grounded in a world that remembers you and cares for you, and as you drift further towards sleep, you can let go of the need to be anything at all, knowing that you exist in a state of perfect, unbothered. One of the most famous and chillingly visible examples of this practice involved Emperor Geta, the brother of the fierce Caracalla. After Caracalla had his own brother assassinated reportedly in their own mother's arms, he did not stop at the act of murder. He ordered Geta's image removed from every single mosaic, every colorful painting, and every marble bust across the entire breadth of the empire. Thousands of inscriptions were edited by hand, his name literally scratched out of existence. Yet in some surviving pieces of ancient art, you can still see the haunting ghosts of Geta's figure, awkward, empty gaps in a family portrait, half faces staring into nothingness, and names that were only partially scraped away. It is history caught in the act of trying to forget, a visual echo of a man Rome tried to pretend never existed. Damnatio Memoriae was not just about vengeance. It was about the absolute control of the future by rewriting the past. If the state could make it seem like someone never truly existed, then maybe their ideas, their rebellion, and their very impact on the world died with them. It was the empire's way of saying you were never here, a form of cultural erasure that utilized stone and iron instead of the digital tools we see in our modern age. But the cruelest part of this punishment was not the fire, or the lions, or the heavy ropes. It was the heavy, intentional silence that followed the strike of the hammer. As the sun sets on the Roman Empire for the final time in our journey, and the sound of the chisels finally grows quiet in the cool night air, let that silence become a deep comfort to you. The marble is crumbled, the emperors have long since turned to dust, and the names that were erased are now part of the same quiet, welcoming earth. The struggle for legacy is over, and all that remains is the stillness. You can feel your own thoughts becoming lighter, like tiny dust motes dancing in a single beam of soft moonlight. The weight of history is lifting from your shoulders, leaving you in a state of pure, effortless rest. But as Rome's memory finally fades into the absolute darkness of the past, and a new, wider horizon begins to stretch out before us, we are leaving the crowded, stone-cold cities and the chiseled monuments behind, moving across a vast, shimmering ocean, and into a completely different kind of wilderness. We are transitioning from the ancient, forced erasure of memory to the wide-open, whispering promises of a new world. We move now from the silence of the Roman Forum to the endless whispering prairies of the American West. A new story is being written, not in chiseled stone, but in the dust of the long trail and the steady, rhythmic creak of the covered wagon wheel. The horizon is calling, and the air is turning fresh and cool with the scent of wild pine and infinite possibilities. Listen to the wind. It is moving west, and so are we. As the final, haunting echoes of Rome's chiseled silence finally drift into the deep, cooling shadows of the past, we find ourselves standing on a completely different threshold. The heavy, confined air of the ancient marble cities and the rigid iron laws of the emperors are replaced by a sudden, breathtaking sense of openness and life. We have moved across a vast, shimmering ocean and into the early 1800s, where the American landscape stretches endlessly westward wild, unknown and whispering promises to those bold enough to chase the setting sun. To the east, the world had begun to feel tight, noisy, and constricted, crowded with the clatter of factories and the weary cycle of fading farmland. But the West, that was the dream. It was a blank canvas. A fresh start where your name didn't carry your old debts, and where nobody asked where you were from, only what you could build with your own two hands. Imagine for a moment the sheer, overwhelming scale of this new horizon. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had more than doubled the size of the young United States, creating an unimaginable space that seemed at the time to belong to no one. It called to the dreamers, the farmers looking for new, rich soil, and the families seeking a quiet peace they could call their own. It was a gamble of everything you owned, for the singular belief that something better lay ahead. Every journey westward began with a quiet, persistent uncertainty, a question whispered around candlelit dinner tables and in the low light of taverns. Would the wagons survive the jagged mountains? In this story, that's the idea. Would the rivers freeze before the crossing was complete? And yet, despite the risks, tens of thousands went, dragging their stories and their futures slowly westward, one rickety, determined mile at a time. Before these pioneers could brave the wild frontier, they had to build a vessel that would carry not just their physical supplies, but their entire hope for the future. This was the covered wagon, the humble, sturdy backbone of the westward migration. There was no fancy carriage or stagecoach. There was a simple wooden box on wheels, held together by sweat, hope, and iron nail. While the most famous type was the massive Conestoga, those traveling the long trails needed something smaller, lighter, and more maneuverable. This became the prairie schooner, so named because its white canvas top, billowing and snapping in the relentless prairie wind, looked like a lone ship sailing across a vast, grassy sea. Inside these survival pods, every single inch was accounted for with meticulous care. Space was life, and excess weight could be a killer on the steep mountain passes. A fully loaded wagon might hold up to 2,000 pounds of essential goods: salted pork, flour, dried beans, and the few precious treasures of a previous life, perhaps a family Bible, a spinning wheel, or a well-worn hand-stitched quilt. To pull this heavy, wobbling load, horses were often far too delicate, and mules were too expensive. It was the oxen, slow, stubborn, and nearly unbreakable, that became the true rhythmic engines of American expansion. But here's the reality that the grand myths of history often forget. Despite what the stories suggest, the pioneers almost never rode inside their wagon. To sit inside all day, jostled by every rock and rut, would bruise the back and ache the bones beyond endurance. Instead, men, women, and even the smallest children walked mile after mile, day after blistering day, their boots carving new, deep ruts into the dusty earth. The wagon was a moving storehouse, a precious creaking container for the seeds of a new life. Some families even carried boxes of baby chicks tucked beneath the wagon bed, dreaming of the quiet morning they would finally settle and build a coop on a piece of land that was truly theirs. As you lie in the stillness of your own bed now, feel the profound, unmoving stability of your surroundings. Unlike the pioneers walking those endless dusty miles, you are at absolute rest. Your vessel is not a creaking wooden box on a rough trail, but a sanctuary of softness, warmth, and complete safety. You do not have to worry about a cracked axle, a sudden storm, or a muddy river crossing. You can let the tension drain completely from your feet, your ankles, and your legs, acknowledging the miles you have walked through your own busy day, and finally allowing them to be still. The prairie wind is just a soft, distant whisper outside your window, and the wide open space is now the peaceful, quiet expanse of your own mind as it prepares for deep sleep. Listen to the imagined, hypnotic sounds of the trail as the sun begins to set over the endless golden prairie. It is a symphony of routine and endurance, the rhythmic clack-clack of the wooden wheels, the heavy, slow breathing of the patient oxen, and the gentle, melodic drone of the leather harnesses. These sounds were the alarm clocks and the lullabies of the frontier. At night, the wagons would be pulled into a circle, not always for defense, but to create a shelter against the cold, biting wind, and to keep the precious livestock close to the heart of the camp. Fires were lit with dry wood, bread was baked on hot stones, and perhaps a weathered fiddle would emerge from a crate to push back the darkness with a familiar, soaring melody. Life on the trail was survival by steady routine. You learned to love the familiar fit of your boots, to ignore the stain of your blister. You learned to mourn the things you had to leave behind and move forward anyway, because the land and the sun did not wait for grief. But in the evenings, under a sky so vast and so clear that it made the distant mountains look small, there was a sense of wonder that no hardship could ever fully erase. The stars over the frontier were the same stars the Romans walked. But here, in the fresh air of the West, they looked like a map of hope rather than a silent witness to judgment. As the deep ruts of the Oregon Trail begin to fade into the tall, waving grass, and the white canvas of the prairie schooners disappears into the rising twilight, the world grows quiet once more. The westward push was a monumental test of will and grit, a story written in real ruts and willpower. But as the pioneers finally settled into their new homes and built their first fires, they brought something with them that predated the wagon, the trail, and even the written law itself, beyond the furthest reach of the wagon tracks, beyond the newest cabin and crew. We find the oldest echoes of our kind. We are leaving the dust of the American West and traveling back into a time before borders, before property, and before the first word was ever carved into stone. We are moving toward the very first sounds that ever moved the human soul. We transition now from the rhythmic creak of the wooden wheel to the primal steady pulse of the heartbeat and the first, haunting melody of a hollow bone flute. We are moving toward the origins of music, the sound that made us human long before we had a single place to call home. The trail is ending, and the music is beginning, as the rhythmic wooden creak of the pioneer wagons fades into the vast, whispering silence of the American prairie. We find ourselves traveling even further, back leaving the maps, the borders, and the written word behind. We are drifting into a time before cities, before iron, and before the first stone was ever laid for a Roman wall. The air here is ancient, crisp, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. We are returning to the very beginning of the human story, to a place where strength was not measured in empire, but in the simple, steady rhythm of the heartbeat and the shared warmth of a flickering fire, before there were instruments made of brass or strings of silver. There was only the body. Music did not begin as a grand performance or a complex theory. It began as a biological instinct, a pulse hardwired into our very DNA tens of thousands of years ago. Early humans discovered that the world was filled with a hidden language of sound. They found it in the rhythmic stomp of a foot on the hard earth, the sharp clap of two hands, and the low, resonant hum of a voice, echoing off the walls of a limestone cave. It was a way to connect, to comfort one another in the dark, and to mimic the world they saw around them. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers huddled together in the deep blue twilight of the Ice Age. The wind howls outside the cave, but inside there is a different kind of sound emerging. One person begins to hum, low and rising tone that vibrates in the chest. Another begins to tap a slow, steady beat on a hollow log. There are no words yet, only the pure raw language of emotion. In this moment, they are no longer just individuals surviving the element. They are synchronized, bound together by a shared melody that pushes back the cold and the unknown. But then, a quiet revolution took place, not in the making of tools or the taming of fire, but in the creation of beauty. Somewhere in the chill of prehistoric Europe, an early human looked at a hollow bird bone and saw something worse than just a remnant of a meal. They took a sharp stone and carefully bored small, precise holes into the bone, creating the world's very first musical instrument. These bone flutes, some dating back over 40 years, were crafted from vulture wings or mammoth ivory with a level of precision that tells us music was never a random act. It was an intentional act of creation, a way to breathe life into the silence. When you blow into a flute made of bone, the sound that emerges is pure, haunting, and deeply familiar. It is a sound that predates the wheel, agriculture, and the very concept of a king. And here is the true reveal of our origins. We did not truly invent music. We simply remembered it from him. We listened to the rhythmic trill of birds, the steady drip of water in a cavern, and the low moan of the wind through the trees, and we found a way to carry those sounds within us. Music is not a luxury we developed once we were safe. It was a fundamental need that helped make us human in the first place. As you lie in the absolute unshakable safety of your own room, feel the ancient rhythm of your own heart. It is a steady, calming pulse that has been with you since the very beginning. You are connected to those first musicians by a thread of sound that has never been broken. Your breath is easy and slow, moving in and out like a gentle tide. There is no need for you to build, to march, or to settle a new land. You are simply here, in the present, listening to the echoes of a flute that was carved long before a first story was ever told. Visualize the flickering, prehistoric fire as it casts long, dancing shadows on the cave wall. The low, rising tone of the flute begins to drift, spinning slowly into the night air. It is a sound that carries the joy, the sorrow, and the mystery of our kind. As the melody grows softer and more distant, you can feel your own thoughts beginning to drift with it. The weight of the modern world is completely gone, replaced by a primal peace that is as old as the stars. The bone flute is a fragile whisper from our deep past, but its message is eternal. It tells us that sound has the power to move the soul and harmonize the universe. From bone and breath, we found a way to speak when words fell short, and in that first melody, we found ourselves. As the fire in the cave burns down to glowing embers, and the last note of the flute disappears into the mist, the world becomes perfectly still. We are leaving the bone and the breath behind, moving toward a final, universal harmony. We transition now from the first sounds of man to the grand, mathematical heartbeat of the universe itself. We are moving toward the final closure, where the music of the spheres meets the silence of your dream. From this primal peace, we find the heartbeat of the universe, and we find the path to rest. As the fire in the ancient cave burns down to its final, glowing embers, and the last haunting note of the bone flute disappears into the rising mist, the world around you becomes perfectly still. We are leaving the bone and the breath behind, moving away from the physical world of survival and toward a final, universal harmony. We are drifting into a place where sound is no longer just a tool for the tribe or a comfort in the dark, but a bridge, a shimmering, invisible connection between the cold logic of reason and the deep, wordless ocean of human emotion. In the sunlight of ancient Greece, philosophers began to ask a deeper question. Why does a certain arrangement of notes have the power to move the soul? It was Pythagoras who discovered that music was not just an art, but a sacred science of the universe. He noticed that the strike of a blacksmith's hammer or the pluck of a taut string followed the same mathematical laws that govern the stars. He realized that when a string is divided into simple, perfect ratios, it produces sounds that feel naturally right to our ears' harmonies, that mirror the very order of the cosmos. This was the harmony of the spheres, the beautiful belief that the planets move in a celestial song, that every melody we create on Earth is merely a faint echoing whisper of that universal rhythm. As you lie here now, feel that sense of universal order settling over you. You are not a chaotic collection of worries or a machine driven by a schedule. You are a part of this rhythmic mathematical balance. Your heart beats in its own steady time, and your breath moves in a cycle as old as the tide. There is a profound, transcendent peace in knowing that the same laws that keep the moon in its orbit are the same laws that allow a lullaby to soothe a child to sleep. You are in sync with the world, supported by a structure that is both invisible and absolute. The true signature of our humanity is found in that music survives everything. It outlasts the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. It survives the long, dusty migration across the American prairies. and it transcends the erasure of history itself. A melody from a mountaintop in the Andes can move a heart in the middle of a desert, because music is a language without borders. It is a force that absorbs every war, every revolution, and every change in technology, remaining the one constant pulse of our species. Soothingly, realize that this music, this signature of humanity, is a force that outlasts even the strongest emperors. It is a quiet, persistent energy that reminds us we are more than the sum of our parts. You are not a machine built for productivity. You are a feeling, thinking, dreaming being. You were born from sound, and to sound you now return. The modern world, with all its noise and its neons, is fading away into a soft, gray blur. The national Wi-Fi of Rome is gone. The covered wagons have reached their journey's end, and the boned flutes are silent in the earth. All that remains is the harmony, as the last bit of light disappears from your mind's eye. Let the weight of the universe carry you into the deep. You are safe, you are whole, you are home. The story has ended, but the rhythm continues in your dreams. The stars are singing their silent song, and it is time for you to listen. Sleep now.